Gospel Light Radio Show. Shout it out question.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a question from our social media platform on Facebook called Shout It Out, and we want to pose this question to my co-host, Glenn McMillian. He serves with the Waterview Church of Christ there in Richardson, Texas. Glenn, how you doing this evening?
I'm doing just fine. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. Now, this question comes from David Gates from the state of Alabama, and he's addressing this question to you. I don't know if he sent you this on the Shout It Out platform or he texted it to you. How did you get this question?
This was actually a comment on my lesson from last month, and we will definitely be addressing that.
Okay, good. Okay, now here's what David Gates says. He says, I'd like to hear the harmony of Isaiah 65, verse 22, and Revelations 21, verses 4 through 6 from Glenn McMillian without a contradiction, please, sir, because the new heavens and new earth still has death in Isaiah and doesn't in Revelations. So how do you explain this question to David?
Well, it's not very often that you teach a lesson and then somebody hands you a perfect example of what you were talking about in the last lesson immediately. But I will thank Brother Gates for doing just that. If you'll recall, last month I did a lesson entitled the AD-70 conspiracy, because there is this idea going around, and it is very akin to a conspiracy theory that Jesus returned in AD-70 and didn't tell anybody, and nobody, and there are people who know about this but are hiding this information from you and have been hiding this information from you for about 2,000 years. So if you'll recall, I made a few major points in that lesson and a few predictions. Number one, the major point that we made was that if you accept that the resurrection has already taken place, the final resurrection has already taken place, and the judgment has already taken place, then you are left with a God that is the same type of God that we condemn the Calvinists for, or the Universalists for, who doesn't really have any consequences for sin after AD-70, apparently. So either we have already been judged, and therefore our fate is already sealed, and there's nothing we can do to change it at this point, which is what the Calvinists teach anyway, or we have already been excused, and nothing we do, again, will change that fate. So that, we are essentially free from the possibility of punishment for sin. So therefore, it is universal salvation for everybody after AD-70. So I predicted that if you make this point to one of these proponents of AD-70 doctrine, that number one, they would not answer that question. They would not even come close to trying to answer that question, and which, as we see, Brother Gates has not addressed that in any way. And number two, they would try to my second prediction was that they would try to drag you somewhere else in Scripture, somewhere that they are assuming you have not studied, you have not read, and try to get you on some kind of small esoteric piece of contradiction or Scripture that supposedly proves their point, or at least puts you on the path to their point. And that's exactly what Brother Gates is trying to do here by going to Isaiah 65 and putting it against Revelation 21. And as I told you in that lesson, there's no point going down this road when they are arguing with you in this way. The fact that they refuse to answer the original question, that they need to change the subject to something else, is in and of itself a weakness of their whole theology. They don't have any answers for the big questions. They're trying to confuse you on all of these little minor details and try to get you to go down this road with them. And once you start knocking over certain dominoes, then, you know, hopefully that will lead you to their big conclusions. But when you stop and think about it, when you stop and look at things from the big picture perspective, none of this stuff makes any sense or makes any difference, because it doesn't address the huge problems that this theology has. So I'm going to do so that should be the end of it, right? That's really all I need to say on this. But I'm going to, against my previous advice to you and against my better judgment, I'm going to attempt to get into what David is talking about here, and and try to show you that even if you do address what he's talking about, number one, it doesn't make the point that he thinks it makes, and number two, it doesn't make any difference, because whatever I say, he's not going to listen to it. He's going to change the subject to something else. So this will be for your benefit, for your edification, and not necessarily for his. So the question that he's asking, if we get back to what he's actually saying, is that there's some kind of conflict between Isaiah 65 and Revelation 21. The verses that he actually cites are not exactly the verses that I think he's trying to reference. But if you go and read Isaiah 65, verses 17 to 23, it starts in verse 17, for behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth, and the former things will not be remembered or come to mind. And Revelations 21, starting at verse 1, I then saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. So both of these verses, if you'll go on to read through to those passages, are talking about the new heaven and the new earth, and there's this the state of things that are going to be in the new heaven and the new earth, and he's pointing out that there are some differences said here between the new heaven and new earth that's mentioned in Isaiah 65 and the new heaven and new earth that's mentioned in Revelation 21. And he's saying, is there a contradiction here? Can you explain or reconcile these two verses without a contradiction? So the thing that you have to first ask yourself is, what do I mean by contradiction? How do we know that two verses are in contradiction with each other? This is a very important point, and this is kind of the reason why I even bothered to address this, is because this claim that there are contradictions between scriptures gets brought up all the time, and it's very important that we understand what a contradiction actually would be in order to answer the question of, is there a contradiction here or not? Things can only be contradictory if they're talking about the same thing at the same time in the same manner, and then saying two different things about them. So if you change any of those conditions, you can have two statements about the same thing that are not contradictory if they have a difference in time, or a difference in place, or a difference in manner. And we see this all the time in Scripture. A good example of this is there is when we talk about when the people that talk to Jesus or have encounters with Jesus in the New Testament. Sometimes there are, in one gospel, they'll talk about one person's encounter with Jesus, and in another document, another gospel will say that person and another person was also with them, and they had that encounter with Jesus. Are those two verses in conflict? Well, obviously they're not. That same person did have that encounter. One verse chose not to, or one author chose not to reference the other person who was also there, but that's not a contradiction. There's nothing contradictory about that encounter. The only difference is that it includes extra details that the other one doesn't include. or when we're talking about prophecies and symbols, which is what we're dealing with here, the same symbol can be applied to multiple things and not be contradictory because there's something different that they're pulling from that. And a good example of that is, the symbol of the lion. Jesus is called the Lion of Judah, but the devil is also referred to as a roaming lion who seeks who he may devour. So are Jesus and the devil the same person because they're both referred to as a lion? No one is going to make that claim. But this is the kind of claim that the people who cling to this 80-70 stuff will constantly do. They'll try to link scriptures together because they're using similar imagery, even though that similar imagery does not necessarily mean that those two things have anything in common. They're just drawing from an image, drawing from a symbol, something out of that symbol in order to make a point. Just because some other passage draws from that same symbol or a similar symbol doesn't mean that they're making the same point or referencing the same thing. And that's the same thing that we have here ultimately. He is saying, because Isaiah 65 mentions a new heaven and a new earth, and Revelations 21 mentions a new heaven and a new earth, they must be the same. They must be talking about the same thing. And therefore, any differences that follow after that must put those verses in conflict. But just because you have this imagery, you have this idea of a new heaven and a new earth, doesn't mean that they're talking about the same thing. Sometimes symbols are meant to be evocative. They don't tie to any specific thing or something that is tangible. There's a direct correlation, one-to-one, between something that happened in this symbol or that this symbol references and something that happens in the real world down the line. It is meant to evoke a feeling, evoke a sense of what's going on and what is going to happen and how things are going to be different. So here we have Isaiah, who is talking to a people in captivity, but a people who are going to be freed from that captivity in a short amount of time. And so there is a sense in which once they receive that freedom from captivity, it's going to be a new paradigm for them. It's going to feel like a new heaven and a new earth, that things have changed so significantly that they are going to feel a freedom and feel a peace that they have not felt in the whole time that they have been in captivity. So there is a paradigm shift that is about to happen, and that symbol of a new heaven and a new earth is evoking that feeling of what that paradigm shift is going to feel like. When we get into Revelation, we're not dealing with people in captivity so much, but we are dealing with people who are under oppression, who are under heavy persecution from the Roman Empire, putting its full weight down on the church during the time of, people argue whether it's Nero or Domitian. I'm not going to get into that argument per se, even though I definitely have an opinion on that. But there was a severe period of persecution of the church from Rome that happened all through the later half of the first century. So when that persecution is lifted, when that situation ends, there is going to be a sense of freedom, a sense of newness that comes with the end of that persecution. And it's going to feel a lot like what they felt like when they came out of captivity back in the Old Testament. And that's why John is borrowing that imagery. John does this constantly throughout Revelation. He borrows images from the Old Testament, which is why if you're going to study Revelation, you need to have a good understanding of how symbolic language was used in the Old Testament. But not necessarily, he doesn't necessarily use them in the same way or to refer to the same things. So it's important not to get so tied into that stuff that you are trying to make these parallels and draw these conclusions about how all these things are going to play out. Then that gets you down into 80-70 or premillennialism and all those kinds of things are usually outflows of trying to tie those symbols together too rigidly and make them have outcomes that are too literal. When they're mostly being used to be evocative and to remind you of things that came out of the Old Testament, but to kind of change what they're being directed to. And going into that would be going into a whole dissertation on Revelation, and that's going to be way too long for this format. And there's a lot of room for disagreement there. So we're not going to get into that tonight. But suffice it to say, again, this is not going to satisfy the person who really wants to know the answer or to see the harmony between these two verses. What I'll say is that, again, you're looking for something that isn't there. There's no possibility for a contradiction because these two verses aren't even talking about the same thing. And even if they were talking about the same thing, you'd have to, first of all, you'd have to prove that Isaiah 65 and Revelation 21 are actually referencing the same thing. The burden of proof is on you to do that. From my perspective, and from I think if you're doing a fair assessment of what Revelation is talking about, it's not trying to make that connection in that way. It's trying to evoke that connection. It is trying to move you to that verse or remind you of that passage, but it's not using that symbol in the same exact way that it was used before. And so there's not a direct correlation between those two verses, and therefore there cannot be a contradiction between those two verses because they're not referencing the same thing. So that is the answer to that question. I hope that, again, I hope that was beneficial to you as a listener. And again, ultimately, is that going to satisfy the person that is bringing this up? Is that going to be useful in a conversation about 80-70? No, it's not, because they're not going to receive that. They're going to stick to their guns about those two things being tied. And once you do that, they're going to jump to, once you tell them what I told you, they're going to jump to another passage of Scripture, something else. And then again, never address the major issues that go along with that doctrine. So I hope that was beneficial for you, and that at least gives you some understanding of, in the context of, yes, there are a bunch of questions that the 80-70 proponents will ask. All of those questions have answers. Some of those answers are actually interesting. Some of those answers are not that interesting. But ultimately, they don't matter because there's bigger questions that need to be answered. There's bigger issues that need to be addressed. And if you get it down into the weeds like we just did tonight and try to answer every one of those minor objections that they will bring up, it's not going to help you. You're going to spend way too much of your time swatting at gnats. You're straining at gnats to swallow a camel. Like that's exactly how it works. So anyway, I hope that's been beneficial to you, and we will continue with your further edification here on the Gospel Light Radio Show.